Hi guys, Yvette Carol speaking, and the third of our Mrs Parata books, Mrs Parata's Problem Pets, by Ruth and Bob Darroch. Mrs Parata was sitting up in bed, with her eyes wide open, before she even knew she was awake. She broke into a grin and started to giggle. There was a hullabaloo out on her back porch, and she knew exactly what the problem was. She hadn't locked up the old hen and the duck. Whoops! Mrs Parata giggled all the way outside, then burst into laughter when she saw her son Joe. He was hurriedly pulling up his pyjama pants and looking very shocked indeed. The hen and duck were off, squawking and quacking their way into the sunrise. "I sat on that stupid duck," said Joe. "Why do you let her perch on the toilet seat at night?" Mrs Parata couldn't stop laughing, but Joe wasn't amused. This wasn't the way he'd expected to start a holiday with his mum. Later that day, after he'd been soothed by a nice breakfast of fried flounder and some of Mrs Parata's special Rowena bread, Joe went out to dig the kumara patch. The sun was shining, and a tui was busy in the kowhai tree, so Joe started to feel better. He enjoyed digging the soft sandy soil, and soon the kune pig came to root around alongside him. Joe scratched the pig's back and talked to him. The pig talked back, unk, 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 unk. They had a very friendly morning working together. "That fat pig is good company, isn't he?" Joe said to Mrs Parata when they sat down to lunch. "Yes, but he's a real rascal." "That one? If I'm not careful, he sneaks inside and gives me a fright, grunting right beside me." Mrs Parata was tired after mowing the lawn, so she decided to put her feet up for a while. Joe stretched out on the couch for a snooze as well. While they had their eyes shut, the kune wandered in and found a quiet place to lie down too. After a while, Joe got up. At the doorway, he suddenly sneezed. The pig panicked. It rushed out between Joe's legs. Once again, Mrs Parata woke up to a hullabaloo. Joe was yelling as the pig squealed out the door with a passenger on his back. Then Joe and the pig went down the steps in a tumbling tangle. Once they were over the shock, Mrs Parata and Joe laughed until their sides hurt. Then they noticed the cow. She was standing near the compost heap, swaying her head from side to side. Her head was stuck in the grass catcher. "She must have tried to eat the grass inside," gasped Mrs Parata. "I didn't get around to emptying it." She and Joe had a real job to pull off the catcher, as it caught on the stumps of the cow's horns. Eventually they managed, and the cow trotted back to her paddock. "Phew, I'd better make sure I keep that gate shut," said Mrs Parata. But the day wasn't over. When Mrs Parata went to bring the washing in from the line, she found the goat had chewed holes in her track pants and was halfway through one of Joe's socks. His flash undies had the seat chewed right out. "Good grief, look at his underpants. What will Joe say about this?" What Joe said was, "I'm going to take the boat out, Mum. I feel safer out at sea." "I think I'll come with you," she said with a laugh. Several peaceful days went by. Then Joe decided to get a hotbed ready to sprout the kumara plants. He had already piled up the rotting straw and horse poo, and now it was time to put soil on top and place the kumara in to sprout. Well, wouldn't you know it? While Joe was bending over, carefully placing the kumara in the hotbed, along came Mrs Parata's pet sheep. Now, pet sheep can be a real nuisance when they're all grown up, and this one decided that Joe looked like a really good target. When Mrs Parata came to see what the hullabaloo was about this time, she found Joe covered in straw and horse poo, wrestling with the sheep. "There's going to be a hungy around here," cried Joe through a mouthful of wool. And they did have a hungy. A kind farmer from down the road took the sheep and swapped it for some meat. All the neighbours came, and everyone had an excellent time. As she looked at her kai, Mrs Parata decided never to get another pet she might have to swap, especially not a lamb or a pig or a goat or a hen or a duck or a... "Oh dear," she sighed, "do vegetables make good pets?" Mrs Parata's Problem Pets.